Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Multnomah County Board of Commissioners Board Briefing. Commissioner Singleton is excused, and Commissioner Brim Edwards will be attending virtually until later this morning. Audience members, I want to start by asking you to please silence your electronic devices. For those presenting today, please turn your mic on when you begin speaking so that the green light is showing, and off when you've completed your remarks so the red light is showing. And for all presenters, please state your name for the record before speaking or responding to questions. Our first informational briefing this morning is an informational briefing on the FY27 General Fund 5-year forecast. This is a follow-up briefing from the presentation offered by Christian and Jeff in November. I want to thank Christian, Jeff, and your team for all of the work that has been done and that you continue to do to make the county's budgeting forecast informative and useful. And with that, I will turn things over to you. Good morning.
Good morning. For the record, I'm Jeff Renfro from the Budget Office. I use he, him pronouns. If we want to go to the next slide, please. Our agenda is going to be pretty similar to what we always do. We'll talk about the economy at a high level, then we'll go into our revenues, our expenses, we'll put it all together into the 5-year forecast, and then do kind of our housekeeping, one-time only contingency and risks at the end. If we could go to the next slide, please. So I'm going to come back to this table later in the presentation and talk through it in much more detail. But overall, we're making very small changes on net. Underneath, there's some bigger swings that are kind of offsetting each other. But at a very high level, we left you in November with the expectation that for fiscal year 2027, we would start with a $10.5 million deficit that we'd have to figure out how to close. We've added in bargaining impacts, some small adjustments to our revenues, incorporated the impact of the Department of County Assets internal service rate constraint process, and then done a little bit of truing up between the requested budget that was submitted by the departments and what we'd assumed in the forecast. When you put it all together, the updated deficit assumption is $11.1 million. We could go to the next slide, please. So we're not going to spend very much time on the economic big picture, but I just want to highlight a few things. So nationally, we had a couple of months where there were surprisingly good employment numbers that came out. But then when you dug into those reports, they included some pretty big revisions to past employment reports. So in January, there was revisions for past months that included about a reduction of 1 million jobs in total. So when you look at the trend for employment nationally with those revisions, it's looking pretty flat and it's looking extremely weak. What is concerning is that it's pretty broad-based. The next one is the sort of normal prices, tariffs, and interest rates that we've been talking about for years at this point. Even though the tariffs were invalidated by the Supreme Court, this is going to be an ongoing issue that I don't think we'll be done with anytime soon. 2 and 3 are connected to each other, what I'll euphemistically call geopolitical strife. There are some big things happening in the world that are affecting the economy. In the short term, specifically, the price of oil has gone up really significantly. That is a key driver of energy prices, which is one of the drivers of our measures of inflation. So we keep kind of looking like we're going to get inflation under control and back to normal, and then we keep having these weird things that pop up and sort of cause that to stop. At this point, I think the concern is that it actually reverses some of the progress that we've made on inflation and it starts going in the wrong direction. As far as interest rates, I think with the Fed looking at the weakening employment numbers nationally, they probably really want to decrease interest rates. But then when other circumstances are forcing them to continue to worry about inflation, making sure they're keeping that under control, my expectation is they're probably going to pause those interest rate decreases. And then finally, locally, the development picture remains unimproved. I think we're seeing the very beginnings of what looks like kind of a bottoming out and a turnaround. But in the 5-year forecast, we're not assuming any significant recovery in values for downtown buildings. If we could go to the next slide, please. And one more. So we'll start with the changes we're making to our forecast for March. The first one, we're decreasing the assumption for motor vehicle rental tax by $1 million. So we're only making this change in the current year and then leaving the out years of the forecast untouched. So motor vehicle rental tax revenue is really highly correlated with activity associated with tourism, and one of the key data points we're always tracking here is the number of passengers flying into the Portland International Airport. That data looks great, and in fact, it looks like this summer we can expect to get back to pre-pandemic levels finally, or maybe even exceed them. There's an expansion of flights coming into PDX. So when we look at the data that should be really closely correlated with these tax collections, it looks great. Looks like our expectation that it continues to grow at the historic level seems sound. That being said, our collections this year are a little bit weak, and we're far enough into the year that I feel like we need to make an adjustment. Something that we're considering and we'll track more closely in the future, even though it seems like a joke, is the University of Oregon home football schedule. So I think what is maybe emerging here is that if we're playing home games against a couple of like big Midwestern or Southern schools that have lots of fans that travel, I think that makes a meaningful difference in our motor vehicle rental tax collections. So we'll truly start looking at the Ducks football schedule every year when we're making forecast decisions. The next change we're making, and we're going to make this on an ongoing basis, is we're further reducing our liquor revenues. So last year we came in shorter than we expected, and then this year collections continue to be a little weak, so we made an adjustment in November. At this point, we've gotten through the holidays, where there's usually a big spike in our revenues around the holidays because people just buy more liquor for our holiday parties. So even after getting through that bump period, we're still continuing to run behind. At this point, there's enough research and survey data out there that suggests people are just drinking less than they used to. So at this point, I think it's appropriate to incorporate this into our long-term forecast. So overall, for March, we're reducing the forecast by $1.5 million. For the year, we're increasing the forecast by just under $700,000. As a reminder, we're trying to be within 2% of our expectation.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah.
Remind me, do we get any direct dollars from marijuana?
Yeah, we do, but it's limited. So we get, it's so small that I've like forgotten all the rules, but we get a portion of revenue generated by retailers, and then we get a portion of the revenue that's generated by the distributors, wholesalers, and producers. But all of that revenue goes into like this big pool to get distributed by the state, and the portion of it that gets distributed to the counties was capped by ballot measure 110. So we get about $850,000 a year. Before ballot measure 110, we were getting about $2 million, and on pace for that to continue to rise. And then we had to reduce that when 110 was passed. And so basically, indefinitely, that cap is allowed to go up with inflation, but kind of no matter what's happening with marijuana revenues, our distribution is basically set.
Okay, thank you for that reminder.
If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so we're not making any changes to the BIT, but I'm going to spend several slides talking about it. So as a reminder, this is our revenue that is highly sensitive to the business cycle, and this is our revenue that could change really quickly. Right now, things look okay, which is why we're not making any changes, but there's a number of, I think, really significant risk factors out here. So this is our current year collections to date. 2026 is in the red line that's on top. As a reminder, September, we started out really strong. We had a very, very large payment from one company that was enough to like change the trajectory of collections for this year. At this point, we're expecting growth relative to last year. I think we are on track right now to be basically dead on to our expectation, which is why we're not making any changes in this year. But as always, March and April kind of tells the real story. So when we come back in May, we'll have a better sense of where we'll end up. If we go to the next slide, please. So we've talked about how the BIT is really highly concentrated, or the BIT payments is highly concentrated amongst a relatively small number of very large firms. So when we're thinking about the economic factors that have an impact on our BIT collections, really the first place we're starting is corporate profitability at the national level. Over on the right side, you see that there was a little hiccup there as there was a decline, but then it looks like things are back to growth. So our assumption in our collections is basically that we have pretty strong growth for the current year. In 2027, we have another year of good growth, and then it slows down in 28 and beyond. We're using that as sort of a hedge against the possibility of a recession. If we could go to the next slide, please. So these are what our actual expectations look like going forward. That orange line over on the right side of the graph, that is, it's supposed to approximate what our historical long-term trend is after increasing the rate in February of 2020. The reason we've been up higher than that consistently is it's really the impact of the federal tax reform in the first Trump administration. It caused kind of a structural adjustment. At some point, when we get a little bit more data, I'll try to adjust that orange line to incorporate the impact of that first federal tax reform. Going forward, my assumption is that the most recent tax reform, H.R. 1, the big beautiful bill, will have not as dramatic. I know I try to avoid saying it, but if I say H.R. 1, I feel like people don't know what it means. I don't think it will have as dramatic of an increase in corporate profitability, but our assumption is that it will push profits up. I think on the last graph that we saw, that recovery in corporate profitability, I think is some initial evidence that that is happening. If we could go to the next slide, please. So this slide is really just kind of a grab bag of issues I want to highlight for you. So the first one we've already talked about, which is the BIT is closely correlated with the business cycle. So if the economy is expanding, we would expect our BIT revenues to expand. If the economy tips into recession, we would expect our BIT revenues to fall. To give you a sense of scale, we have a couple of different recessions in the data that could provide some model for how to think about a recession going forward. The dot-com bubble in the early 2000s, we didn't have any one year where there was a dramatic drop, but instead we had 3 consecutive years of drops, which if you talk to people who were here at the county at the time, they will tell you that that is maybe even more difficult to deal with than something more dramatic, or a more dramatic sudden change. In the financial crisis, we had all of the decline happen in 1 year. It was about a 36% year-over-year drop. If you took 36% of what we expect our current collections to be, that's like a $50 million drop, to give you a sense of what that might mean for us. And then the third recession in our data is the COVID recession, which had absolutely no impact on our collections. Point number 2 is H.R. 1 and then the Oregon State connection. So when the federal tax reform went through, it created a sort of known negative impact on our collections and then kind of an unknown positive impact on profitability and therefore our collections. So as we're reading about the state doing the partial disconnect from the federal tax code, so there's some definitions of net income that flow through from the federal tax code to the Oregon State return, and then our BIT tax return references lines on the state tax return. So that's how it changes in the federal tax code end up flowing all the way through to our collections. So for us, the impact of H.R. 1 is that it took some of the income that would have been subject to the BIT and it sort of takes it out of that calculation. The partial disconnect reverses a lot of that. The bonus depreciation was the biggest portion of that. So even as H.R. 1 passed and then the disconnect happened, we haven't made an adjustment in the forecast because my assumption going in was basically that the reduction associated with the change in definition of income would be mostly offset by an increase in profitability. At this point, I think whatever's happening with profitability is going to have a bigger impact than whatever's happening on the margin related to definitions of income. So our collections so far look like they're on target. We'll continue to watch this to see if there are any unexpected changes associated with all this tax stuff. The third point is increasing concentration of profits. So at a national level, profitability looks very strong. But then when you dig into the data, there's a pretty small number of extremely, extremely profitable companies that are driving a lot of that. That just creates more uncertainty and volatility in the system. We just become more and more reliant on an even smaller number of companies and their profitability. And then the last point is just we're just not in a period of certainty right now. And so this is mostly just me telling you, based on where we are right now, I think we're making all of the correct assumptions. At some point in the future, I could come back and something has dramatically changed in the world and we need to adjust our assumptions. So we watch this very closely and we'll keep you all updated if anything changes. If we could go to the next slide, please. This is mostly here as a reference, but this is initial weekly unemployment claims. This is our initial sort of warning alarm for any recession that we might see. As you can see, initial weekly unemployment claims still remain at a very low level. That is sort of offset by the decrease in the number of job listings and openings. So the employment picture looks a little bit more precarious than it was, but we're still not seeing that translate into actual layoffs to a significant degree, despite some of the big layoffs we've seen here locally. If we could go to the next slide, please. This is also mostly just here for reference. We've seen an uptick in the unemployment rate, both for the state and for Multnomah County. And then employment, there's like a little bit of an increase on the end of both of these graphs, but Multnomah County remains below our pre-pandemic level for employment, and then Oregon is looking like very flat. Next slide, please. And then finally, just kind of the one fun, interesting graph I want to show to talk about some bigger economic trends. So you've probably read about this, but this is a graph from the Federal Reserve put out. This shows the total consumption by income tier, and it shows that since the beginning of the pandemic, the percentage of total consumption that is accounted for by the top 10% of income earners has increased really steadily, and we're now at a point where 50% of the consumption in the country is done by our top 10%. There are a number of implications of this. One is similarly to when we're talking about the BIT, if we're reliant on a smaller and smaller group of people to be driving those collections, if we're reliant on a relatively small group of households to be driving consumption, which really drives economic growth, both in the United States, but then sort of American household consumption is really a driver of global economic growth as well. If we're relying on a relatively small group of people to be doing that, that should make us all a little bit worried. And then also implications for just income inequality and all of the conversations we've been having at the county for years and years. I think a thing to note is that even if we take like the kind of classroom view of how the economy works and think about demand driving supply and the interplay between those two things, something that's oftentimes left unsaid is that in economics, demand is defined as ability and willingness to pay. So if 10% of households are the ones who have the ability to pay, then the economy is going to continue to provide the services that they demand, and then we'll sort of undersupply services that everyone else needs.
And Jeff, what is that in dollar amounts in terms of like the top 10% of earners in the US? And if you don't know, that's...
I don't know off the top of my head. I can find that for you.
I can also Google it, but thank you.
Yeah. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so we've talked about a bunch of these things, but we're going to come back to the 5-year forecast and go through this in a little bit more detail. So the changes we're making for this forecast, the top line is bargaining impacts that we're incorporating. So that includes contracts that have settled or contracts that are currently in mediation. This is a little bit in flux, but so we'll come back as contracts continue to settle and we'll update these numbers for you. The second line is a reduction in our U.S. Marshal and liquor revenues. I already talked about the liquor change. U.S. Marshal is really, I changed the forecast for 2026 in November, and then I just forgot to incorporate that in 27 and beyond. So this is me just doing that. The next line down is, so before the chair provides instructions to all of the departments to go work on their requested budgets and submit them to us, DCA goes through a separate process to put together the internal service rates. Then those are used to inform the department's decision making. DCA went through their own constraint process. Through that, they ended up cutting about $6.8 million relative to what they expected their current service level to be. When that all gets run through the model, the impact on the general fund is a little bit less than $3 million. That's an ongoing savings, so we've incorporated that. And then the next line after that, this is a line that we included for the first time last year. So when departments submit their requested budgets to us, in the budget office, we go through and we check their assumptions in the requested budget against every assumption that we're making in the forecast model. We always do a little bit of truing up. It tends to be a smaller number in this, but there's a couple of things that are making that number big. So just in the interest of transparency, we're putting that there. The two big changes that account for about half of that $2 million are we committed to doing a non-rep wage study, to doing 2 non-rep wage studies. Based on the financial impact of the first one, we assumed that the second one would be similar. It ended up having very little impact on the general fund. So our assumption on the ongoing costs associated with that, we just kind of relaxed that assumption. And then DART, because it's not subject to the constraint, is treated separately in all of our modeling. And we make an assumption about the ongoing costs of DART providing their services. When they put their budget together, due to a couple of retirements of sort of highly paid people and their internal services coming in lower than expected, their actual costs of providing the current service level in 2027 was about $420,000 lower than what we were expecting, so we incorporated that change. Everything else is just like little adjustments of like $100,000 here and there. So again, when we put all that together, the deficit would be $11.1 million. That box in green down at the bottom is just a reminder that we have to balance the budget. Balancing the budget in 2027 has an impact on those ongoing assumptions. So once the budget is balanced, if we incorporate the savings associated with whatever adjustments that we make to get there, then our starting point in 2028, we would expect to be a $10.6 million deficit. And then finally, I want to talk about a change that we're not making, and that's in that bottom right-hand corner. So for the 2027 COLA, we expected it to be 3.7%. When the government shut down at the late last year, we knew that was going to disrupt data collection for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who puts together the Consumer Price Index, which is what our COLA is based on. So we put a little work group together. Did I say? Oh. Did I say 2.7?
You said 3.7.
3.7, really sorry. It was 3.3%. Thank you, Christian. We had assumed 3.3%. So we knew that there was going to be a disruption and it would have an impact on the calculation of our COLA. We put a little work group together to think through this, and when the actual CPI numbers for the end of 2025 came out, if we just took those numbers and calculated the COLA, it would be 3.1%. But the missing data point in October actually lowers that COLA calculation. And then there was basically consensus amongst economists that the November CPI number was just too low based on how the data collection was disrupted. So we recommended that we just continue to offer the 3.3% COLA. Labor Relations has been working with all of the bargaining units to sign a memorandum of understanding that says, we know the calculation is 3.1, but we're going to continue to offer you 3.3. Just in the spirit of what the COLA is supposed to represent, we thought that this was fairer. If we could go to the next slide, please. And one more. Okay, so one time only for 2027. When we left you in November, we thought we would have $25.4 million available. When we incorporate the March forecast adjustments that we talked about earlier, and then we take out what we think the 2026 bargaining impacts will be. Even if those don't hit in 2026, there would be a retro payment in 2027. So we think it would be smart to use set some one-time only aside to pay for that. Then that last line, the $1 million, is we'd set money aside for potential settlements associated with the Supreme Court decision that invalidated the way that we'd been doing foreclosure auctions on houses that had delinquent property tax bills. We think that we have the resources to cover any future settlements on that, so we think it's okay to transfer the remaining $1 million from that back to the general fund. That leaves us with $21.3 million. By board policy, you would spend at least $10.6 million on county facility, IT, and capital projects, and then you'd have $10.6 million left to allocate to whatever you'd like to. If we could go to the next slide, please. Just a quick contingency update. You still have $1.6 million in regular contingency and just under $900,000 remaining in additional contingency for uncertainty, for a total of $2.5 million in non-earmark contingency. There's still the $100,000 lobbying transparency earmark that's left, for a total of $2.6 million in contingency. We've had a few questions about this recently. We also include the $21 million of BIT contingency, which is set at 12% of expected BIT revenues. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, and then risks, we've talked about this, but open labor contracts as kind of our significant amount of labor contracts is coming to an end. We're restarting some of our negotiations with our bargaining units that weren't included in this most recent round. Number two, as we've talked about, slowing economy locally and nationally, and just all of the stuff that is going on in the world has implications for our financial picture. And then finally, our partners at both the city and the state, I think, are continuing to go through some significant budget issues of their own, which could have spillover effects for us. If we could go to the last slide, please. With that, we'd be happy to answer any questions about any of this or just the budget process generally.
Thank you so much, Jeff and Christian. Just really appreciate this walkthrough and keeping us up to date on how things are going, especially with some of the changes in revenue that we've seen since the last time you were here in November. I'm going to open it up to the board for questions. I'll start with Commissioner Moyer.
It feels like over the last year, it's been an unpredictable ride of what policies may be coming from our federal government. I still haven't grasped a consistent theology, or, I mean, I think there are some things we can tell, certainly a decrease in taxation, but other things that are impacting the potential revenue and economic growth, not just of our county, but nationally and internationally. With that level of volatility or difficulty predicting, what level of certainty or variability would you say, like, we should take this projection with? Like, and what types of situations that are either happening or could happen should we take into consideration might impact some of this?
Yeah, so I think one thing that there's sort of all this noise, right, in economic policy, and then I think this administration is also is very sensitive to what's happening in the stock market. So I think we see over and over and over again, there's some sort of big policy rollout, and then the stock market reacts negatively, and then there's a really quick sort of stepping back. So in all of this, I try to be aware of what's going on and understand the implications, but then also continue to come back to the hard data. And so until we see a significant change in layoffs or a real deterioration in the employment picture, or we start to see corporate profitability sort of turning over in a more significant way, I think those are the things that would make me say we have to make a change to some of our assumptions. I think as far as what the level of confidence is, I think given the current reality, I feel pretty good about where our BIT forecast is, which is why I didn't change it. But I also feel like we're in a situation where next week, something could really dramatically change that. So I think the existence of risk itself is maybe on its own not something that we should make us change the forecast or make drastically different decisions, but it doesn't feel great to know that like something could happen that would force us to make different decisions. I hope that was like a helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know it's not exactly what this graph is showing on slide 13. I think that's more the earning versus spending, but it is an indicator, as are other indicators, that we are seeing significant, and not just regionally, this is actually globally, a hollowing out of the middle class and income inequality skyrocketing. And when we think about that type of a trend and the concentration of wealth with such a few and a growing number of individuals who are falling into needing potentially assistance just to get by, what level of vulnerability does that create for revenue, or how we have to like balance projected need with our tax base?
Yeah, so I think you know, the economy is very good at creating high wage jobs, and it's very good at creating low wage jobs, and it's gotten terrible at creating kind of anything in the middle. So because of our revenue structure here at the county, we're a little bit shielded from this, just because in the general fund we don't have an income-based or a personal income-based tax. But I think at a really high level, people who have a lot of money tend to spend less of it, right? So the term economists use is marginal propensity to consume. So if you give a household another dollar, how much of that do you expect them to go out and spend? For high-income households, it's really low. For low-income households, because that additional dollar is going to go to food or rent or clothes or kind of some of the basics, they're going to spend it. So if we have a situation where more of the income is being concentrated amongst households that aren't just going to go out and spend it, there could be some positive implications for the amount of resources that are available for investment. But also, I think when you look at the global economy, it seems like we have enough investment out there to respond to the actual appetite or capacity to go out and do it. So the economy probably would benefit from a more equal distribution and just more of the economic activity that then turns into income for households, turning into consumption and turning into something that's more immediately productive.
Those are my questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Brim Edwards.
I appreciate doing the deep dive into what's happening. It looks like not a substantial, at least sort of net change. I'm curious just with the volatility, well, first of all, the slide's not labeled, but the economic overview page that has just sort of the 4 things that are impacting us: the weakening employment nationally, price, tariffs, and interest rates, geopolitical strife, and development picture unimproved is a sobering slide. And I am curious your thoughts, having about sort of the sort of predicted future with this volatility. So having lived through on a public board the 2002 and 2003 recession, where things just kept going down. I'm curious about what you think, and they went down sort of mid-year after all the projections were set, the budgeting happened, it was a nightmare for any sort of public institution in the state at the time. So I'm curious about whether you think that could be what we see here, or is this more localized in that the weakness is more just in Multnomah County versus in 2002, 2003, it really was being driven by just the national economy and the dependence in Oregon statewide on the income tax?
Yeah, so I think 2002, 2003, I think it was really driven by sort of the national picture. Here, so I think that we are too late in fiscal year 2026 for anything to really significantly change the trajectory of our BIT collections. I think for fiscal year 2027, if we maybe get through the summer without any significant deterioration, we might be okay for all of 27. And then it becomes what do we think is happening in 28? I think we are very sensitive to the idea that it's really difficult on everyone to make mid-year changes, which is why I think it's about balancing, as much as possible, we want to make hard decisions in the budget process when kind of the whole organization is ready to do it. At this point, I think even though there's a lot to worry about, I think when you look at the hard data, there's just not enough to justify making a different decision about our revenues. I'll say this is also why, we fully fund our reserves and everything like that to basically buy us time if there's a significant change in the economic picture that happens at an inconvenient time for us.
Remind me, because I don't think, I've been here, that the county has ever dipped into reserve since I've been here the last couple of years. What are the triggers for use of that reserve?
So for the BIT reserve, which we intentionally budget in contingency, it's a board vote. So you all would decide to potentially allocate it to some use. For the reserves,
The 3-vote trigger?
yeah. For the reserves, because they're budgeted as unappropriated, we can't use them. Like, we can't actually say we're going to spend it on this. What we do is, I would come and I would say, the BIT is going to be significantly lower than what we expect, but rather than make any cuts to programming, we're going to let the reserve, which is essentially just a big pile of money, absorb some of that reduction in the BIT. So it just allows us to avoid making cuts when we have a significant change in revenue mid-year.
Good morning, Christian Elkin, County Budget Director. I use she, her pronouns. I do want to remind us, though, that in this mid-year process that you just finished, we did use the supportive housing services reserve, or contingencies and reserves in that exact manner. So it would be a very similar process where we would have a significant board discussion. We would have an update to the forecast. We would be bringing all of the pieces and the policy decisions forward to you all. But you have done it. So and that was a very conscious decision because of the impact of programming, so that we could, extend the conversation into this next budget process.
Yeah, and I'll just add, and thank you for mentioning it, because I was gonna do that too. I mean, we have a board policy of what our BIT reserves need to be, which right now I think is 12%. I think the ideal one is 15%. But so anytime we would choose to use those, we would really be looking at replacing those in the next year. So, same thing, similar to how we're looking at now over 3 years, refilling the SHS reserve. So it's something you can do it, and I know you know this, but for the public, we would use it once, but then we would immediately need to make that up in the next year or in the next short period of time.
And there's just a follow-up question. Thank you. The follow-up question would be, our general reserves, not the BIT, well, I guess this BIT reserves, the general reserves, that somewhat is also impacts our credit rating by having adequate reserves, I'm assuming. Is it also the BIT, or is it more the general reserves?
When I've was a part of the bond rating meetings, during the library bond discussions, they really liked that we also had that additional BIT reserve. So I'm not sure if it's considered necessary or best practice, but I will say that people point it out and they give us congratulations on it.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Jones-Dickson.
Yep, thank you, Chair, and thank you both for the briefing last week. It was extremely helpful. Just have one question from slide 7. What's the name of the business that paid the most as far as BIT?
I can't tell you. Sorry, okay. I can't tell you. Yeah.
Legally, he can.
Yeah, I could go to jail. Yeah. So.
Okay. Got it. That's my only question, I think. But my other questions were answered through the presentation and from Commissioner Moyers. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I appreciate all of the work that you did on, just putting this together and giving us a clear picture of where we are as we're looking ahead to start our public budget process in just about a month. So this kind of sets the table for that, but also understanding like what the outlook is for the subsequent years as well, is keeping it in mind as we make some really tough decisions ahead of us. So thank you both very much. And with that, we will move to the next presentation, which is also a forecast, which is the informational briefing on the Preschool for All financial modeling and implementation update. And Jeff, I believe this is you again. And Christian's going to hang out because it's fun, so.
Thank you. For the record, I remain Jeff Renfro from the Budget Office, he, him pronouns. This briefing is going to be a little bit different. In the past when we've done it, I've had the PFA team up with me and we've done kind of the whole program overview. Today this is going to be much more narrowly focused on the revenues and then just a couple of updates on kind of putting all the modeling together. If we could go to the next slide, please. So just a very, very quick reminder on the details of the tax. 1.5% tax imposed on taxable income above $200,000 for joint filers, $120,000 for single filers. There's an additional 1.5% for a total of 3% on taxable income above $400,000 for joint or $250,000 for single filers. It applies to income derived from sources within Multnomah County for non-residents. The tax is currently scheduled to increase by 0.8% on January 1st, 2027. And then we also, in the implementation of the tax, the board voted to include a deduction for business pass-through income that's already subject to the county BIT. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is an update on data I've shown you in the past. As a reminder, this data about the income breakout, like what the actual makeup of income for our payers is. This comes from state tax returns, so this is not from the PFA returns. So I ask the State Department of Revenue every year to look at Multnomah County residents who have filed state income taxes who look like our payers. So they have our tax code and they have written some queries for me that generate a population of state income taxpayers that look like they probably pay a PFA, and then they tell me information about those people. Because it comes from the state, there's a significant lag here. So this is from tax year 2023. I'll mostly be talking about tax year 2024 today. So the majority of the income that's subject to the PFA tax comes from wages, salaries, and tips. This is a much smaller percentage than the overall percent of income subject to the state's income tax that comes from wages, salaries, and tips. And so most of that difference for higher income people comes in capital gains. Capital gains is a significant portion of the income in tax year 2023, but this is a much smaller percentage than it was in tax year 2021. That's reflective of the fact that 2021 just was an extremely, extremely high year for capital gains. And then also a big portion of it comes from Schedule E income. I think the easiest way to think about Schedule E is that it's rents, it's pass-through payments from S-corps and things like that. So passive income is usually the way that people describe Schedule E. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, I've put all of this here as a reference, but it's too much information, so it's hard to read. So if we could go to the next slide, we'll look at just a smaller portion of it. This is a comparison between tax year 2023 and tax year 2024, the third and fourth year of the tax. So overall, it shows about a 2,000 filer decline in total returns. My expectation is that when we update this data later on, it'll show an increase year over year between 23 and 24. As a reminder, when we were having kind of this public conversation about all of this about a year ago, after the October extension filers had submitted their returns, it showed about a 6,000 filer decrease between 22 and 23. At the time, we said, this is still a relatively new tax. A lot of people are still paying late. When we updated 2023, after May, it showed an 8,000 filer increase between the original version and then the newer version. Yes, Commissioner? Oh, no. Oh, you were just saying, great. Yeah, I thought that was a hand raise. So I think maybe sort of the overall theme for this presentation is what we're observing is the PFA tax moving from the kind of implementation phase to being a more mature tax that everyone's used to. When we were first implementing this tax, our consultants told us it takes 3 or 4 years for a tax to kind of get fully set. So that 2,000 filer decline, if you look in our income tiers, most of that is in that lowest income level. And what is happening there is, for lack of a more technical term, we have a bunch of tax filers that submit kind of a weird return, right? And we end up getting a bunch of returns that have 0 taxable income, but they have a positive liability. So the return says, I'm not reporting any income, but I am reporting that I owe you money. So that is associated oftentimes with like penalties and interests, or people coming back and truing up something that they've done previously. So that stuff tends to come in a little bit late. In these summary documents, I have to put those somewhere, so I put them in the under $150,000 category. So a lot of that stuff just hasn't shown up yet. So I think when we update this later, that 2,733 returns and that lowest income category will bump up significantly, and it'll take the total number of returns to a place of year-over-year growth. The other thing I want to point out is for almost all of the other income tiers, we're seeing what looks like a sustained growth trend over the second, third, and fourth year of the tax. And in fact, the number of returns above $500,000 now exceeds what it was in the first year. So I think when you look at 4 years of returns altogether, you see sort of an initial adjustment between the first and second year of the tax. I think that is some combination of potentially some filers leaving. I think it's also just the impact of 2021 was just a really strange year related to that high level of capital gains. So I think a bunch of filers probably, their income went back to a more normal level in 2022. But then since that initial adjustment between the first and second year, it looks like pretty steady growth. If we want to go to the next slide, please. This is an update on some analysis that we've been showing since the second year of the tax. This is looking at tracking our top 1,000 filers from the first year and what's happened to them, and then also looking at our top 1,000 filers from the most recent year and looking back at their history. So from tax year 2021 to be one of our top 1,000 filers, you needed to make a PFA payment of $28,464 or more. At the time, that was 2.7% of the returns, but it was over half of the total collections. When we track those individual filers, 367 of the initial 1,000 did not file a tax return in 2024. I'm very limited in saying why that is. All I can say is that they just did not file a return. When we updated you last year, that number was 310. So we continue to have an increase in the number of our initial high payers who are missing from the current tax roll, but that trend, it looks like it's slowing down significantly. Yeah, yes?
Do we have access to the age?
The age? No, I don't have age. I have name, address, and then if they're withholding, I know where they work.
Okay. I just bring this up because peak earning is at 49. I mean, it varies a little bit within there, but like, people don't earn like this. People earn like this. So I do think there are some reasons, but I didn't know if we had age.
Yeah, and I'll say, I think that raises a point I was going to make at the end. I think this is probably the last year I'm going to report on this exactly like this, because as we get further and further away from that first year, I think it just becomes less useful. So we'll get creative and think of some other way to show tracking our high payers over time. That 602, that's over on the right side there. So out of that initial 1,000, 602 of those initial 1,000 filers paid us less than 50% in the second year than they paid us in the first year. So this is really just getting at the volatility of the income of our very high payers. Looking at tax year 2024, to be one of our top 1,000 filers, you had to pay $25,447 or more. It's a similar percentage of returns. But again, due to the change in capital gains, it's a little bit less than half of our total collection. So still very highly concentrated, just not as much as it was in the first year. When we look at those top 1,000 filers and look at what they did in previous years, 167 of them did not file a tax return in 2021. When we looked at our top 1,000 filers in tax year 2023, we had 160 filers who had not filed in 2021. Out of these top 1,000 filers, 592 of them paid us more than 200% of what they did in tax year 2021. So that's either they're a new payer or they're paying us significantly more. Again, a huge amount of volatility here. So again, I think when we look at this, when we look at the 4-year trend, I interpret this as like we're sort of just settling into the status quo here. If we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to show you 2 scenarios here. I'm going to start by saying I think this is a little bit, the timing on this is a little bit awkward. In less than a month, you're going to get a huge presentation on the Preschool for All tag that's going to include all sorts of different scenarios and a report that has a huge amount of information in it. But I just wanted to show 2 different versions of this. So the first one, this is the updated baseline. I want to be really clear about what's in here. This still assumes 11,200 seats needed at Universal. The next one I show is going to incorporate the lower population assumption. The reason I'm showing you this one is that this is what is currently in our official baseline model. And as we go through the end of the tag process and we get through the public process in the summer, we'll officially arrive at some new population forecasts that we'll incorporate into all of our baseline modeling. This also assumes that the tax increases by that 0.8 on January 1st. So the shape of this should look familiar. We still have this period as seats are ramping up to Universal where expenses increase really quickly. They start to exceed our anticipated revenue. So that period where the pink line is above the blue line, that's when we're spending down our dedicated savings to offset those expected deficits. Excuse me. If we could go to the next slide, please. So then this slide is where we show if we expect it to all work. So the green bars are the number of seats we expect to provide in each year. The blue line is our expected fund balance. So if the blue line stays above 0 for the entire implementation, it means we expect dedicated savings to be sufficient to offset our expected deficits. This is very similar to what I showed you last year for our expected baseline. It shows that fund balance dipping below 0 in fiscal year 2033. As I said last year, given the magnitude of the numbers we're talking about and the frankly very small changes we could make to our assumptions to make this line look very different, I wouldn't worry about this too much. I think this is something that we should continue to watch, but just because this line dips below 0, 6 years in the future doesn't mean we need to make any sort of drastic changes now. And this is really motivated by the fact that, in the modeling, I know, it's really because we're projecting out so far in the future because we feel like we need to look at the whole sort of implementation through universality. I can make very small changes to our revenue expectations or very small changes to our seat cost expectations. And then you push that out through so many years and it changes this line very quickly. If we could go to the next slide, please. Oh, yeah.
Just to clarify, this still uses the 11,000?
Still uses 11,200.
11,000, and it still has the 0.8%?
Yes, on January 1st, 2027. Okay. Yep. Okay, so the next one, this makes 2 changes. So this incorporates the lower population assumption. It assumes that we need 8,500 seats at Universal. This is the what the tag has used as their tag baseline that they've called it. When you get the bigger presentation next month, that baseline makes some assumptions around the number of other publicly provided seats that we'll get into. But 8,500 assumes that the Preschool Promise and then the Head Start seats stay roughly at the same level that they are now, like a little reduction, but the tag has some scenarios that look at a steeper decline in those seats. This also assumes that we decrease the increase in the tax, or sorry, we delay the increase in the tax by an additional 2 years. So it wouldn't kick in until January 1st, 2029. We'd collect most of that revenue in fiscal year 2030. So a couple of things that are probably intuitive, but I'll just point out, if we hit universal at an earlier stage, then that ramp up in expenses evens out a lot earlier. And then we hit a point in which the revenues and the expenses are more closely aligned much earlier in this process too. It would be in 2032. If we could go to the next slide, please. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question about the previous slide? During the time period in where the expenses exceed the revenue, it looks like 2026 to 2032, how much is that in total? And do we have that much in reserve?
That's the next slide.
Oh, never mind. Okay.
The total amount, I'd have to look at the model and add it all up. I could get you that number, but yeah, the next slide will tell us if it works or not. This is intentionally kind of a garish color because I want it to be visually distinct from what we showed before. So if we have a shorter period of deficits and then some of those deficits aren't as big because the expenses level off earlier, we spend down much less of the dedicated savings. So under this scenario, the fund balance bottoms out at above $200 million, and then it takes off again pretty quickly starting in 2033 or so. So with that, if we could go to the next slide. And before we go to questions, I just want to briefly note that you all asked us to provide some of this additional context before the chair's budget was proposed. So with this, we've officially done the CGF, SHS, Library District, and PFA. So I just want to note we listened to you, and hopefully this is helpful.
Thank you so much for providing this information. I'm sure there'll be some questions about this. So we'll go to the board for questions, further questions. Commissioner Brim Edwards.
So just so I understand the process, so we're continuing, these slides continue to use, or at least at the county, you continue to use the projected seat numbers at 11,200, even though we know it's going to be lower. And I think I heard you say this, but you can correct me if I misheard, but that when we go through the process, the upcoming process of hearing from the technical advisory group and also the program advisory group, that a new baseline will be established with the new numbers?
Yeah, so for the 2027 budget process, the number of seats we assume at Universal doesn't have an impact on 27. It has huge implications for 28 and beyond, but we can go through our whole 27 process. The PFA team can come talk to you about what they're planning to provide in 27, and we don't have to have anything finalized beyond that. And then yes, so
I just wonder, like, why would we continue using numbers that aren't?
So I will say so we haven't officially adopted the new numbers because as Jeff said at the beginning, the timing of this presentation is a little awkward because we are going to be presented next month with a whole bunch of information of people who have been digging into these numbers. However, knowing that this was and this board is going to be doing work and really kind of updating our assumptions, I think later this summer. However, for this presentation, knowing that we were in this kind of transition period, I asked Jeff to put together slide 9 and slide 10, which does assume a lower population number and does assume the delay in the tax, which is what is currently being talked about for the TAG and the PAG. So if you're curious about what that impact is on the program, that's why slides 9 and 10 are in there.
I guess I'm just also looking for the FY '27 budget, why we would use numbers that aren't the
Because those are still the numbers that the demographer that is, of record has still, they haven't updated those numbers yet. And as Jeff said, it doesn't actually make that much difference for FY '27. It will in FY '28. And so I encourage you to, if you have further questions about the FY '27 impact, to meet with both either Jeff or the team or both together to kind of walk through what are those
Well,
impacts.
I think it actually harms somewhat the county's credibility if we're continuing to use numbers that, we should update, this is what we talked about last year, we should update the numbers. I will just say one of the reasons why, in addition to having accurate forecasts and people understand the cost of the program, which I think allows us to have a different conversation with the community if they believe that our numbers are solid. But the other thing is that the big aha for me was that if we're much closer to universality, where is the gap? And if you look at the map, the gap is mostly in sort of the inner east side, the west side, and I would hope during this upcoming budget process, we're looking at how are we closing this gap versus having the perception be that we still have a long way to go, and there's not, a fairly long way to go versus like we're almost there, and really the short strokes are really need to be in like a very focused area if we're going to get to universality. So that's why I think it's important for us to like make this shift. And it's like, if we make the shift, we're going to make it in this summer when we have these longer conversations. But I also think it's hard going into this budget process saying, well, we know these are a different set of numbers. We're just going to use because we had them before versus actually we know that we're evolving to these to this other baseline. I think it's confusing, and already there's enough questions that were raised about sort of where the money is and how much the reserves are. And so I think the more that we can try and continue to sharpen exactly, what the cost of the program is and how we need to fund it, because otherwise there'll just be continued, I think, questions in the community about like how much money do we need.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I think you raised some really good points about, like, if we are closer to universal than we originally intended, how can we best allocate the preschools to make sure that we're reaching universal coverage? So, and I think that's something that our department is really, and the division is really aware of, and considering that as they're thinking about the work that's going to be happening in the next year or in a couple of years to do that. So I think that's good. I think we'll hear more about that from the department when they come and present during the budget period. And we are in a transition time, but nobody has like blinders on or is ignoring some of the data. It's just that we really want to be thoughtful and have the process take place in terms of like how we're updating the numbers, and especially being planful for the long term to make sure we have both the resources to fully fund universal preschool and recognizing that what that looks like and what the need is going to be different. And we're doing that work, and I appreciate all the work that's been done by both Jeff in the budget office as well as the division and the folks who are serving on the TAG and the PAG.
I appreciate that. However, we still have like the slide 8, and I do appreciate that you said we shouldn't worry about slide 8 because it's this long-term projection, but that's the one that still has the other number. And there was a lot of worrying happening about this last year. And the slide doesn't say these aren't the actual numbers, we shouldn't worry about it. So to me, we have a public document that represents this. And so this is, I think, worrisome like on its face until you get like the sort of footnotes and everything out. So again, I think we're stronger the more that we sort of nail down this, whether it's the true cost of care or our best projections, and they are going to be projections, I know that, but I just think it will be helpful in our discussions so that we keep people focused on the goal and how we ensure its long-term stability. I did have a question on the tax piece of it. So on slide 4, the tax year summary by income tier, this is combining just individuals and joint returns. So while we may have somebody like, so we should just keep that in mind, looking at the different tiers. That we have different thresholds, so while somebody might be at 250, if they're an individual, it's very different than if they're a joint filer. On the slide with number 6, we see from 2021 to 2021 to 2024 that that top 1,000 has dropped from 53.9% to 45.8%. And you said you might, this may be the last year you do this. Are you still think, it still seems relevant because they're just such a huge number. It also, in some ways, I'm going to be curious to see about does that mean that then individuals who are over the thresholds but with lower incomes they must be paying more, they must be paying more of it. And so I'm curious about why we wouldn't want to be tracking that, or is it just you want to present it in a different way?
I just want to present it in a different way. I think, we're still going to be very, very focused on our high payers. I think the issue is that as we get 5 years out from the initial tax, if in the next year we had more people from our initial top 1,000 who left, I think in that 5-year gap, I would start to say, well, I don't actually know why that happened between 4 and 5, and it probably has less to do with tax implementation, and it's something else. But no, we'll still be very, very focused on these people. We'll just come up with some other way to visualize it or to track over time.
Great. I mean, I think it is hard to explain. However, it does seem relevant because I think, just looking at the drop, it's whatever, 8% drop of the top filers paying the portion they pay of the revenue. And so I think it's also because there hasn't been indexing is is that being picked up by people who are moving into paying the tax? So
we also had a drop in the total collections. Our first year collections were so unexpectedly high, and then it dropped after that. So I think a lot of the explanation for that drop is the decrease in capital gains and some of that just sort of going away and not being replaced by anything. I'll also say I think a challenge going forward is in 2024 there is something that, because the payment has been made, I'm not allowed to talk about it specifically anymore, but something very weird happened in 2024 that is going to make that data look strange too going forward.
a lot of asterisks.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Again, this is, I think, super helpful for us to have just as policymakers thinking about sort of, and how do you sustain a brand new program long-term? Thanks.
Thanks. And did you have a follow-up question, Commissioner Moyer, to one of Commissioner Brim Edwards?
Yeah, I think it's important since the PEG and the TAG have wrapped up their meetings, they're still working on their report.
No, they're voting on their recommendations this week?
No, I think they already did.
April 1st is the...
April 1st.
Okay, well, they're writing the report. I've watched a lot of it, and I think it's important that there are several unknowns, not just two competing population numbers, which there are still two competing population numbers. I tend to think it'll probably downgrade, but maybe not be 8,500. But there's also conversations, and I think it's important because just as I would caution anyone from the 11,200 number being full enrollment. I would caution against any other specific number because, one, there's still debate, but also there are other factors that impact that. Like, we had a 77% participation rate, which I think, based on DC and others, we could easily adjust that to 90 to 92%, which I think is highly likely. We already are seeing a drop in Head Start, which impacts some of that. Preschool Promise, we have frankly, it's an incredibly difficult program for people to participate in. There are other unknowns. You mentioned true cost of care. That could absolutely impact this. I don't know to what degree we will, as a commission, want to address access for infant toddler, but we are seeing some reduction in access because PFA is a more profitable model, and frankly, providers lose money in infant toddler. We have an impact on that market. We may or may not choose to engage in that, but I just want to make it clear to the public that we're still working through some of these assumptions, some of which we can land on, some of which are a little bit, we have to watch trends. I also think it's really important when we talk about revenue to look just outside of our PFA collection. And I've looked at the Oregon Department of Revenue, I've looked at national. 2021 was a total outlier for capital gains, like just this bizarre blip in an otherwise not super variant line that had to do with a number of factors, the pandemic being one of them, favorable time to cash out. But if you took out the outlier of 2021, which is weirdly for this tax our first collection year, which throws it all off, we are actually seeing a steady increase of our top filers. If you were to take out that blip of 2021, just looking at 2022 to, I think we've only gotten to 2024, maybe 2025 data, it actually increases the number of the top 500,000 plus taxpayers. So I do think I get really nervous when people want to spin a narrative about like there is this dramatic shift from 2021 to now, when 2021 is just an absolute outlier. And if you took that number out and you looked at the tax base on all other years, it's not an outlier. It's the steady growth that was projected when this tax mechanism was contemplated. I do think you raise a good point about things like the budget process and how do we go into that, where some of these things are not, we haven't landed on what we're gonna use as projection. I caution assuming that we actually have all the answers yet, because I think that there are some things that we are actively working on. I think the TAG and the PEG did a very good job of actually laying out the information they didn't have that made some recommendations difficult to make, because under one scenario, it wasn't a big deal. Under a different scenario, it was a bigger deal, and so they couldn't reach either consensus or just felt like they didn't have the information. But I think it's important to have that context, to be clear with the public that like, we are still very much doing the work, and that there are some areas that I think are hopeful for our revenue projections for this program, but I don't want to like project we absolutely know, because we don't yet, and I don't want to get people saying, well, why haven't you taken action, Multnomah County, if you know blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, actually, we're still trying to land with the best possible information, and we are actively seeking some of that information.
And we're going to continue to have that conversation over the next several months. So I appreciate that. I don't want to skip Commissioner Jones-Dixon for your questions or comments on this. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to the presentation next month and hearing from the TAG and PAG. No additional questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Did you have any additional questions or comments, Commissioner Moyer? No. And just to be clear, so on April 1st, the PAG and the TAG are going to be voting on their, to endorse or accept the recommendations report that is being drafted and to note any reservations that they have. And then we as a board are going to be hearing that full report out from them later in April. So we'll all look forward to that. I don't have any questions. I do want to say, though, I think that the point about 2021 that you've made and that others have made is really a good one, because we see the same thing with the SHS revenues, right? Like the first couple years of that tax, which happened at the same, implementation happened at the same time as the preschool for all tax, was really, hugely drastic. And the difference between that one was that we were expected to spend those dollars or use those dollars, where we knew with Preschool for All we were going to be needing those dollars in the out years of the program, and so we have had our dedicated savings for that. Now I think it's really what we're going to be looking at over the next several months is what we need to do, what exactly is our need, and there's a lot of different factors, as Commissioner Moyer have raised on that, but I think we have a much clearer picture of what the trends do look like, without the 2021 in there, and I appreciate you raising that, Jeff. I think it's really important that, and I think it's clear that it is a very positive sign after the concerns were raised that PFA might be driving higher income earners out of Multnomah County, that the latest data shows consecutive years of growth with those higher income earners. And in fact, the most recent data shows that the higher number of returns among those making $500,000 a year annually than even in the first year it was collected, which was 2021. And once we account, and I also think that it's important to note that the timing of those late filers that you're talking about, because it's almost similar to how you started the last presentation about the jobs report. The jobs report was here, but then they updated it and it totally changed the picture. And I know that we saw that last year, as you've noted, and so I'm looking forward to the late filers and the other factors and how that's going to ultimately impact what we're going to see for 2024. To know that filers is going to increase more once we have those data. I do think that we've heard the concerns that high income earners were leaving Multnomah County were, valid fears, because we are concerned about our tax base, both for Preschool for All program and our overall tax base. Thankfully, this latest data shows that there's no evidence of losing the now growing tax base for that. So I think that is incredibly important. I know that this data that gets presented here is highly politicized. There's a poll happening right now about the Preschool for All tax that makes assumptions about people leaving or not that doesn't reflect this latest data. I think it's our job as a board to analyze and adjust to the trends using the most up-to-date data, using our knowledge of what is happening with the program, what is happening with the population that we're serving, and the needs of the families and the providers and the workers there, to be able to really make those informed decisions. So I want to thank you, Jeff, for doing a good job of always giving us the clear information as much as possible, and also for the commitment of this board to continue working on this. So thank you. All right. So that includes our revenue forecast update for Preschool for All. Our next briefing is an informational board briefing on the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office Human Resources Unit. I want to thank the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office for being here today. And I think the sheriff is behind a pillar, so there she is. Good morning. Thank you, Sheriff Morrissey O'Donnell and Jenny Carver, for being here today to provide the board with this important update. We know that our community safety departments, especially the Sheriff's Office, have faced staffing shortages for years. One of the most important budget decisions this board made last year was to provide additional investments to the office to address this gap. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about the impacts of that investment today. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Sheriff.
Okay. Good morning, Chair Vega Peterson and Board of County Commissioners. I'm Nicole Morrissey O'Donnell, Multnomah County Sheriff, and presenting with me today is Jenny Carver, our Deputy Chief of Staff. So I appreciate the opportunity to provide an update on recruitment, retention, and overall staffing, including the ongoing impacts to our work at the Sheriff's Office related to persistent vacancies, particularly within the Corrections Division, where these challenges have been most pronounced. Additionally, I want to note that this presentation is in response to the budget note for this fiscal year 2026. We continue to remain in a complicated and challenging time where MCSO's staffing shortfalls collide with an increase in jail use in Multnomah County. As our local public safety agencies begin to rebuild staffing capacity, and there are coordinated initiatives to address public safety concerns, we naturally see an increase in law enforcement's ability to address calls for service, engage in proactive activity that could be through traffic safety and enforcement, as well as providing an increased presence in our communities. This results in higher levels of booking activity, while we still have adults in custody on significant charges who have longer lengths of stay. To clarify further, the Sheriff's Office correction system is central to a well-functioning public safety system. When it is not operating efficiently, for example, staffing shortages and/or funded jail capacity, it places an immense amount of strain on our law enforcement partners, limits our overall effectiveness, and impacts community safety. Additionally, the movement of processes that the Sheriff's Office is responsible for is critical as to not delay or grind the entire criminal justice system to a halt. It's for these reasons that our Human Resources Unit is a foundational component of public safety success for MCSO. We have a very positive story to share today about how we have leveraged the investment from this board, the knowledge and experience from our partners in central HR, as well as within the Sheriff's Office, to create an HR unit that has the capacity to fill vacancies in a timely manner and be responsive to the changing needs of this organization. It is also important to recognize that a multi-year staffing crisis cannot be reversed in approximately 1 year, which is why this investment has been and will continue to be so critical. I am proud of the progress we have made so far, and we recognize there's still a great deal of work ahead to address the ongoing challenges of staff burnout, retirements, and other factors impacting workforce sustainability. We can go to the next slide. So to provide a bit more context for why we're here today, I will briefly outline what brought us to this point. Over the last several years, we have discussed the growing staffing crisis and the need for a properly funded HR unit at the Sheriff's Office. In 2021 and 2022, nearly half of the corrections workforce separated, in part due to a large number of retirements stemming from the extensive hiring pushes that we had in the mid-1990s. While our HR unit has worked diligently to hire corrections deputies, what this led to was significant hiring delays in other parts of the organization, including law enforcement and civilian professional staff, which further worsened this emergent situation. The combination of the corrections staffing challenges and the ongoing unfunded liabilities within the Human Resources Unit brought us to a mid-year budget modification in November of 2024. When I was here to request the board's approval of this funding, I spoke about the significant impact within our corrections division, resulting in multiple system concerns, including booking and housing area post-closures, over-reliance on mandatory overtime, which creates staff burnout and low morale, and the inability to be flexible in addressing jail capacity as the population increases. Also to note, staffing challenges within our corrections facilities have been repeatedly identified through the annual corrections grand jury process and the community inspection process conducted in compliance with the county charter. The progress that you will see today is directly tied to this investment. Without these ongoing resources, we would not be able to adequately address and be responsive to community concerns reflected in these year-over-year audits and assessments. Next slide, please. So you may remember this slide from November of 2024. It illustrates the current number of HR staff dedicated to our hiring process based on the FY 2026 adopted budget and what it looked like prior to the approval of the budget modification. I'm showing this to you again just as a visualization of the number of positions assigned to HR specifically for the hiring process. In 2022, we began operating with 8 background investigators, 4 of which were supported by county general funds, and those are the icons in green, and 4 of which were not, and those are in yellow. We had a similar funding situation for our recruiters, operating with 2 funded positions and 2 who were not funded. And finally, our support staff, where we had just 1 funded position and 2 unfunded positions. With the initial budget modification, and then again receiving FY 2026, the Sheriff's Office was allocated general funds to cover the unfunded positions and expand our background investigations team from 8 to 10, our recruiters from 4 to 5, and added a 4th support position. I will now turn it over to Deputy Chief of Staff Jenny Carver to discuss our progress in more detail. And we can go to the next slide.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Sheriff. Good morning, Chair Vega-Peterson and Commissioners. For the record, my name is Jenny Carver. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Deputy Chief of Staff for the Sheriff's Office, and I oversee our Human Resources Unit. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you today. We began the complicated work of updating our hiring process by setting a clear goal to create an HR team that had the capacity to be nimble and responsive to the needs of the Sheriff's Office. We identified indicators that we could rely on to show us whether or not we were headed in the right direction. Those indicators include reducing the average number of days from application to hire, the duration of background investigations, filling sworn positions, and reducing the vacancy rate for our non-sworn teams. We used those indicators to examine patterns in previous years and then relied on the expertise and experience of our HR staff to find our opportunities for change. Our first priority was to find a way to increase capacity for background investigators. We started by breaking down for each classification every step of a background investigation and identifying which steps were required by law or county personnel rule. This led to a transformative change in our hiring process for non-sworn staff. At the direction of the sheriff and because of her leadership, we streamlined the background investigation to focus our efforts on a criminal history records check for CJIS or Criminal Justice Information System clearance, a questionnaire for compliance with PREA or the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and an employment screening. Our partners with Central HR were a huge support as chiefs and hiring managers were asked to make hiring decisions with less information than what they were used to. And we also, they also provided individualized training to help those hiring managers navigate the trial service period once an employee was hired. Much of what is included in the hiring process for sworn positions is required by law. Even so, we updated the corrections deputy hiring process by replacing a panel interview that was done for all eligible candidates with a command staff interview for just those who passed a background investigation, and identified additional vendors for the required psychological and medical assessments to ease the scheduling congestion at the end of the hiring process. As you can imagine, these changes needed to be managed thoughtfully and carefully across the agency. We used a template to document our proposals that became familiar and allowed HR staff to be a part of building detailed solutions and giving their feedback that could then be reviewed by division chiefs and hiring managers and finally approved by the sheriff. This helped us to be transparent and accountable along the way while building awareness and investment. As we implemented the changes, we returned to HR staff, chiefs and hiring managers again and again and asked, how is this going? Did we achieve what we hoped? How can we learn and adapt? And while we were mindful of change fatigue, we didn't shy away from making adjustments when it was needed. Though we still have work to do, especially in our corrections division, we can see the impacts of these changes when we look back at 2025 and that we have a lot to be proud of. Next slide, please. So this chart provides a look at our hires and departures agency-wide over the last 5 years. The gold bars are the hires, the black bars are departures, and then you can also see the net losses and gains each year. Departures include both separations and transfers out of the sheriff's office. So if there was movement within the sheriff's office, that's not reflected in the departures. The sheriff mentioned today and many times before the dire impacts of a staffing crisis that started in 2021. You can see that clearly here. In order to address the rising number of vacancies, the previous sheriff hired a number of recruiters and background investigators in 2022 using vacancy savings. The impact of those additional staff is evident in 2022. We were able to hire nearly 100 staff and we have less departures for a net gain. Though unfortunately that impact begins to dwindle in 23 and 24 when the number of departures stays consistent, but the number of hires begins to decline again. In 2024, we begin in earnest to design and implement the updates to the hiring process, and in early 2025, we had hired the staff provided by the additional funding in late 2024. This really pays off in 2025 with more than a 50% increase in our hiring and a net gain of 32 staff last year. Next slide, please. This chart tells a similar story, but from a different point of view. This is our vacancy rate as of February of each year since 2019 through just last month. The gold line shows the vacancy rate agency-wide or for all of Sheriff's Office staff, the black line for all sworn staff, and the green for all non-sworn staff. Vacancy rates generally increased and decreased together from 2019 to 2021 with a slight increase for non-sworn staff vacancies in 2020. And then in 2022, you see the vacancy rate for sworn staff increase significantly, and as that makes up most of our staff overall, it pulls the agency-wide vacancy rate up with it. As I mentioned in the last slide, in 2022 is when more HR staff are hired, and they are given the intense focus on filling sworn vacancies. That has an impact in 2023, but the inability to adequately address the non-sworn vacancies, particularly for our facility security officers and our records technicians, results in the continuous increase you see in 2024 until it peaks at more than 12% in February of last year. Which leads us to just last month, where you can see the vacancy rates all coalesce near 7% agency-wide. This illustrates that we have been able to focus our efforts toward filling all vacancies rather than filling some at the expense of others. We can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so even with this outstanding progress, our corrections deputies and sergeants continue to work through the challenges of persistent vacancies. Partly that is due to the immense amount of highly regulated and complex work that goes into confirming each new deputy for hire. Here, we wanted to provide a closer look at that process. So nearly all the elements of the hiring process for our sworn members and our corrections deputies are dedicated by Oregon law, which is readily available on the Oregon Department of Public Safety Standards and Training, or DPSST site. So we looked at 2025 as an example when we received 909 applications. Once an application is received, a recruiter screens the candidate for the minimum qualifications. If a candidate is qualified, they're invited to complete 2 assessments. The first assessment is required by law and is administered by the National Testing Network, or the NTN assessment. This is a national test used to evaluate candidates for public safety careers and measures essential skills like judgment, observation, teamwork, communication skills, reading ability, and report writing. The second assessment is the Personal History Questionnaire, or PHQ. The PHQ reviews many of the same elements as a full background investigation, and looking back, it has shown to be our greatest indicator for whether or not a candidate will pass that full background investigation. Including a PHQ at this point helps reduce the amount of time invested in the hiring process for both the candidate and the HR team. Candidates that pass the assessments are deemed eligible for hire and invited to complete a personal history statement for the full background investigation. On average, it takes about 10 weeks to reach this stage from the day a candidate submits their application. 196 candidates out of the 909 that applied in 2025 reached this stage. The elements of the background investigation are also mandated by law. They include reviewing criminal history and arrests, education, employment history, finances, relevant associations or memberships, military history, driving history, at least 3 personal professional references where they've lived and records from those locations, and a social media history. Our background investigations currently take about 12 weeks on average to complete. 40 of the candidates that applied in 2025 have passed a background investigation, and another 40 are currently in the process. Of the 40 candidates that have passed the background investigation, 34 have passed mandated psychological and medical evaluations. On average, this takes 4 weeks or less to complete. Once a candidate passes those evaluations, they are confirmed for a hire date and enrolled in training. Of the 909 applications received, we've confirmed 34 for hire. This includes employees we will welcome, or corrections deputies we will welcome on March 30th and April 27th. Next slide, please. Okay, So what's next? I look forward to continuing to support the HR team and being nimble and meeting the needs of the Sheriff's Office. Our next steps include staying responsive to data, working on our recruitment strategy, and supporting work on retention. The MCSO Planning and Research Unit has enabled us to use data to drive our decisions through the creation of multiple dashboards. Updated monthly, our hiring dashboard tracks hires, departures, transfers, and promotions, and our vacancy rate. The retirements dashboard uses years of service and age of our members to calculate retirement eligibility so we can anticipate the number of possible retirements, both in the next year up to the next 10 years. Finally, a staff movement dashboard breaks down departures by each job classification and allows us to see in great detail who is leaving, how long they stayed with us, and why they left. We also continue to work closely with the communications unit to update our digital media recruitment strategies and materials for outreach. We are lucky to have such an active social media presence, and in the last year have updated our recruitment ads for deputy sheriff and corrections deputy positions. Using the application hire and departure data, we are working on making a shift to build our messaging around the current workforce, focusing on the benefits that are available and recruiting for the Sheriff's Office as an agency rather than a specific position. We, like other public safety agencies, have been responding to the need to move away from the idea that we can recruit people right out of college who will stay for 25 or 30 years. Finally, we're working closely with the Wellness and Equity team to improve our retention strategies. Specifically, we're formalizing our process for exit interviews and developing a plan to analyze that data annually and make it available for MCSO leadership to drive organizational culture and change. And we're also working through the implementation of state interviews, a benchmark for the county workforce equity strategic plan. Before I turn it back over to the sheriff, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the immense amount of courage it took for the sheriff, the chiefs, our hiring managers, and members to implement these changes to how we hire. Our amazing leaders for the HR unit, Director Jeff Heinrich and the Recruitment and Background Supervisor Carrie Kern, have been invaluable in shepherding this work and leading a team of truly dedicated and highly skilled background investigators and recruiters. None of this would be possible without their honesty, their dedication, and their willingness to trust and engage fully in the process to building these changes. Thank you again for the opportunity to highlight this work. And with that, I'll turn it back over to the sheriff. Next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I also want to highlight that Jenny's project management skills and the style for leading this process improvement and the dedication and support to our HR staff really set up our ability to begin making great strides within this work. And I would like to thank the board for the opportunity to present this information today, and we're happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you so much, Sheriff. Really appreciate the presentation today. We'll go to the board for questions. We'll start with Commissioner Jones-Dixon.
Yep, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sheriff and Deputy Chief Carver, for just the presentation and the updates. The only question I have is just around the vacancy rates. Like if someone doesn't make it through the corrections deputy process, are we inviting them to consider the non-sworn positions if they're eligible? Like, are we intentionally doing that?
Yes, absolutely. In our sworn roles, if there's opportunities for other areas of the organization that might be a better fit, then we review that with our chief deputies and our team, and we potentially offer those opportunities to ensure that we're able to fill other vacancies if we can.
Got it. Great. Thank you. And again, thank you for the presentation and for the update. It's good to see just where the investments are going and the impact that it's having on the overall, just the department and on the community as well. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Commissioner Moyer.
Yeah, this is an area I'm not wildly familiar with, although thrilled to see bringing it all down to 7% vacancy, which I think is the county-wide vacancy average or near it. So not knowing the history of, recruitment and how many people make it through and all of that, are what we're seeing with the numbers of the 900 interested translating to 34 hires. Is that in line with traditional trends? Are we finding it more challenging to get recruits all the way through the process due to whatever? I just don't know how that ranks historically.
This is something that I'm also interested in. So for this presentation, we looked back specifically at 2025, and we were able to break down the number of folks that withdrew from the process or just didn't move forward because they stopped responding or didn't show up for an appointment with our background investigators or recruiters. We provided, as part of these changes, we provided very explicit guidance for our background investigators and recruiters about how many times they should reach out, what methods they should use, and then when they should move forward. So I am interested in looking back at comparing 2025 with 2024 and 2023, though I don't have that currently at my fingertips.
And during the exit interview process, I don't know where you are in your process of changing that, but are there any trends that have raised flags of things that as an organization we should think about in retaining workers?
I'll begin by one of the biggest areas of concern that I have seen, and then I'll let Jenny follow up, is the mandatory overtime, being uncertain about what that really looks like until you're in the position. And that has been a huge strain on our newly hired workforce.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. When we started to move through formalizing the exit interview process, we actually looked at specifically what we had heard from corrections deputies over the last couple of years that have left. We have about a 30% response rate for folks who leave voluntarily and engage in exit interviews, and the more than half of them cited work-life balance, which I don't know how many of them specifically called out the mandatory overtime, but that was absolutely a theme that we picked out.
And when we look at sheriff's departments broadly, what are their vacancy rates? Is this a Multnomah County experience? Is this an, a Oregon experience? Is it broader? I don't have I do know that there was a big boom of hiring in the 90s, so that obviously is probably impacting other communities for retirement, but I don't know how our vacancy compares with other jurisdictions.
I don't specifically have that data in front of me. However, what I can say is that when I attend national conferences with the largest sheriff's offices in the nation, there were and continue to be staffing challenges. Partly, we've went through a complete transformation and how opportunities that people have for employment over the last 5 years. So it was very challenging to recruit people during a pandemic, during really an uncertain time, to be working in a 24/7 responsive congregate setting and or in our community. And so that is in alignment with some of the changes that we have made with recruiting and connecting with candidates and really highlighting and showcasing our work on social media and different platforms where people can see what this work really is. I do also know that people are starting to come out of those staffing challenges. Not every agency, but I really believe that the investments that we were able to put toward human resources and all of the changes and process improvements, that has really allowed us an opportunity to make these significant gains. Still recognizing a year or a little over a year, there's work to do. And given the immense amount of vacancies that we had in this organization, we're doing great work, but it doesn't stop within 1 year. We have some work still to do.
Great.
Commissioner Brim Edwards.
Thanks for the presentation. I'm glad to see progress is being made. Since I got on the commission, the issue of just coming out of COVID and the retirements, the issue of adequate staffing in the sheriff's office, especially in the corrections division and also the facilities services unit also have been sort of under pressure. And, I think because this is not something that the general public has the ability to sort of see or experience, it's often sort of a hidden issue. And I really appreciate you, Sheriff, that you have really advocated for the impacts, not only on staff, but adults in custody, when we have staffing shortages. And I know the first year you asked for some the resources you needed for HR. I advocated for the full amount, that you got half of it. I was glad that, I think it was last year, that the full amount, or in the end of the previous year, you got the full amount for HR support, and that it's starting to pay dividends. So I'm really glad to see that. I mean, I think maybe Commissioner Moyer, one of the things about the issue with the vacancies and why it matters, and this is, based on sort of the corrections inspections that we're required to do, and also I had a chance recently with Commissioner Jones-Dixon going out to the East County Courthouse, but also just doing a regular courthouse tour, seeing what the impacts are when there aren't enough staff. And I look at it that the sheriff can't run, when you have vacancies, can't decide, like a lot of other people, like, hey, we're not going to run 7 days a week, or we're going to restrict hours because just the nature of the work. There has to be someone there, and this is, I think, anecdotally, what I've heard is just the mandatory overtime is really stressful on people who do that work because they've worked a long shift, and then having a mandatory overtime because there's not really any options besides that to fill shifts. It has a huge impact on staff, but I think it's also worth noting that just the staffing also has impacts on adults in custody, because you need staffing to staff visits with lawyers, visits with visitors, a whole host of things that happen inside that need staff to happen, that, or even allowing adults in custody to have walk time every day that requires adequate staffing level. So the impacts aren't just on the staff, but also the adults in custody, but also the impacts on the broader community. So when, for example, the jail is at capacity, there's booking restrictions. I'm just wondering whether, Sheriff, you could talk about just whether you've had recent booking restrictions, and like how you see, do you see the staffing up as actually leading to fewer booking restrictions? I think we've had fewer yellow alerts, which is when we get to 90% capacity, but maybe talk about sort of how you see the impact of the added staff and sort of the future, and how that impacts the broader system, whether it's community safety or the staff.
So what is critical for us, and what I would like to get to, is where we can be nimble to the public safety concerns and challenges in our community. And what we are seeing is that with this staffing challenge still ahead of us, as we're making progress but still have some work to do, we are unable to be nimble if bookings increase, but also the budget for requesting the budget for additional jail capacity without the staff to open those additional dorms. We are currently in limited booking status. The population or percentage has continued to maintain right around 90%. And it does create challenges across the system. When I spoke earlier about being central to everything in the public safety system, ensuring, and you mentioned some of them, ensuring additional programming time, ensuring that there's social visiting and professional visiting that's open, reasonable hours, making sure that we can transport individuals to court proceedings. It affects the entire, not just in the facilities, but in our courthouse, as well as any of the areas where our facility security staff is working to bring people into those buildings for court hearings from the community, or to be present for a court hearing for a family member in our community. So again, the ideal is to have an organization that meets the needs of our community and our public safety partners. And that is my job, to advocate for community safety and for what our community expects when there is a bad outcome or someone's a victim of a crime, or they're supporting someone that is in our custody, to ensure that processes are moving in a timely manner and that victims are able to have closure and adults in custody are able to move on in the court process. So there are several areas that staffing challenges and shortages at the Sheriff's Office impact. And as we continue into the summer months, we'll monitor our jail population and capacity very closely and make the decisions that we need to ensure that we're doing everything to support community safety and our law enforcement partners out there doing great work.
Great. And then just a follow on the, so there's limited booking right now in place?
Correct.
So what are some of the things that, because you don't have enough staff, that would have normally, a law enforcement officer could bring somebody in and have somebody booked that right now, because of the staffing restrictions?
So it's twofold. We don't have budget to open any additional beds either. So working through and navigating, getting our staffing levels up, but also remember that we've had many discussions about the budgeted FTE for corrections was not taken into account all of the additional leave and the required training through DPSST for certification. Those adjustments were not made in the FTE amount of staff running our corrections facilities. So there's a lot of competing priorities. When we approach or get to 90%, limiting booking, as well as when we approach and get to 95%, that requires emergency population releases to ensure people, our law enforcement partners, can book people at the front door of the Justice Center.
So I'm sorry, what are the things that can't be booked right now because of limited booking?
So right now, we're booking all felonies, all warrants, all mandatory arrests, and misdemeanor person crimes. And we can provide that list to you.
And so normally when you'd have a list of other things that could be booked, when you limit booking?
Lower level offenses, such as trespass and disorderly conduct.
Great. That's all the questions I have. Thank you. And I really like the slide of the 900 down to 30. I didn't like it, but I thought it illustrates the challenge of, well, it seems like you might have a lot of candidates to actually get to people to hire. It is, you've got to have a big funnel at the top to get to that number. So I appreciate the work that's happening, and I think it has made a difference already. Still work to do, but made a difference for both the staff that work at the Sheriff's Office, but also for community safety and for the adults in custody. So thanks for the work.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
And ongoing advocacy.
Great. Thank you so much for this. I have just a couple of questions, and if you don't have the data right now. So I would love to see the vacancy breakout by role, especially the breakdown between law enforcement and corrections deputies, because I know that there's a difference there, and the slides didn't get into that level of detail. So I would like to, if you could send that out to the board. And then I'm curious about the, I know one of the issues was the big boom in the 90s with hiring, and I think the slide that talked about all of the folks who were who retired in, I forget where that slide was. Maybe it was slide 5, where it shows the departures and the net loss, like in 21 especially, was big. But I'd like to know where we are just in terms of eligibility for retirement from that hiring boom, and so that we can, I think the board can have a sense of what that's looking like in terms of the impact of that hiring on expected retirements or eligible retirements. And I think you mentioned, Jenny, that you had a dashboard, but I'm assuming that's an internal dashboard that shows that. Yeah, so if you could provide that information to the board, that would be great. And then I know you had mentioned, Sheriff, the impacts of leave on one as being an issue affecting, the real staffing needs of the sheriff's office. I think that is something that is actually impacting our entire organization as we look at the impact on leave. So just if you could provide some information on the percentage of staff who are on leave would be helpful as well.
Yes, we can absolutely do that. The other thing I would like to add, just on the sworn side, when we hire somebody today, it takes nearly a year for them to be working on their own in the law enforcement division and about 6 months for the corrections division. And then in addition to the leave around FTE and budgeted FTE, also the training requirements to maintain certification through DPSST impacts that level as well.
Yeah. Just appreciate all the work that's gone into this. Again, thank you, Jenny, Sheriff, everyone on the team who's been working on this. It's great to have this information presented here and look forward to the follow-up information as well. That concludes today's board meeting. Our next meeting is scheduled for Thursday, March 19th, 2026 at 9:30 a.m. This board will be going over to City Hall, though, at 12:30 today for a joint meeting with City Council, which we're looking forward to. There being no further business, we are adjourned.